This episode is sponsored by Linode. Do you need a Linux server for your latest creation? Then check them out. They provide native SSD storage, 200 gigabit per second network connections, Intel E5 processors, and top-of-the-line hardware to run your servers on. It deploys Linux in seconds from a Linode cloud, and you can choose your Linux distribution and node location right from the manager. They have locations in Asia, North America, and Europe, and a sweet set of tools to make it easy to manage it. If the web interface isn't your thing, they also have an API and a command line. They also provide two-factor authentication, IPv6, DNS manager, plumbing, scaling, and everything else you would want. So get the most out of your Linux node by checking them out at linode.com or devchat.tv/linode. Hello and welcome to episode 93 of React Native Radio. I'm your host, Nader Dabbit. Today on our panel, we have Spencer Carley of Handlebar Labs.
Hello, everyone.
Lee Johnson of G2I.
What's up?
And today our special guest is Max Lynch of Ionic. Welcome to the show, Max.
Thanks for having me. Super excited to be here.
Yeah, great to have you on. This is really cool. Ionic was kind of like my first successful foray into kind of like mobile development, I guess you'd say, as a JavaScript developer, and I've been a huge fan ever since. So it's really cool to have you on and talk about all this stuff.
That's awesome. Yeah, it feels like a long time we've been doing this, but I guess it really hasn't been that long. Things just move really quickly in this space.
Yeah, so can you give everyone a quick intro, like of who you are, if they don't already know, and kind of like what you do, I guess?
Yeah. So, my name is Max Lynch. I live in Madison, Wisconsin. I'm a Midwesterner, and I've been working on this company, Ionic, for the last about 5 years. And basically, Ionic, if you're not familiar with it, is primarily an open source project that helps web developers build apps for the App Store, but now increasingly apps for the mobile web, like progressive web apps and Electron and things like that. So focus on just helping web developers be productive. And the company behind Ionic, I'm the CEO of the company, and we help increasingly big teams that are trying to build a lot of different mobile apps. Not just the ones that you'd see in the App Store, what we call like the flagship consumer apps, but also, things for every line of their business. So it's a really exciting space to be in. We're constantly learning. It's fun to get to do open source as a full-time job. But yeah, that's pretty much what we do.
So is the company behind Ionic also called Ionic?
Yeah. So we started the company back in 2012, and we were doing something different. So if you were familiar with jQuery Mobile, we built a tool called Cordova, which was like a drag and drop developer tool. And this was on the homepage of jQuery Mobile for a while, and that's kind of how we got our start. But in 2013, we felt like there were some improvements that we could make to jQuery Mobile, and this was kind of around the time like Angular was blowing up. It was kind of like a perfect storm. jQuery Mobile we felt like there were other things we could do to improve it, and Angular was kind of really spearheading like single page apps and web developers building serious apps. And so we built a UI framework targeted at that developer base called Ionic, and it kind of took off, and we pretty much stopped doing all the other stuff in the company and focused on this Ionic framework. And so today, we kind of use Ionic as an umbrella for a lot of different things, but Ionic framework is really the flagship open source thing that we're most known for.
So you said that you're in Madison, Wisconsin. That's an interesting place to be for such a hot tech company, and a company that has done so much, not only in the U.S. but like around the world. That's pretty cool. Can you kind of talk about that for a little bit? I know like a developer, Josh Thomas, personally pretty well, and he works with you there. I like him a lot. So there's obviously just building what you've built, there's a lot of sharp people there. But just out of curiosity, has it been different than running a company maybe on the West Coast or something there and finding developers?
First of all, shout out to Josh, because I think he told me a story today about how he was there from the beginning of your guys' podcast. So it's kind of small world.
Yeah, he was actually at the dinner where we discussed starting this podcast. Me and 4 or 5 other guys.
he's a big reason that we're doing more with React, which we can get to later. But yeah, I grew up in Milwaukee, and I went to school at UW-Madison, majored in computer science. And kind of in college, I was spending a lot of time on Hacker News, actually, and I still do to this day. I'm kind of addicted to it. And I kind of got a little bit of the startup bug. This was like in 2007, 2008, so it was just kind of starting. And I was trying to think about what I wanted to do after college, and I felt like my grades weren't good enough, and I wasn't a good enough academic student to go get a job at Google. And it just felt like risky trying to rely on passing an interview. I know interviews are kind of a big source of frustration in this community. So I felt like starting a startup was kind of a good way to get a little control over my career.
We kind of started this company here just by accident in Madison. It just so happened that what we worked on the side got off the ground and people used it. And I think really it's amazing what you can do today if you're building an internet company, because you're pretty much international on day one. And so for us, like, our customers weren't necessarily in the Bay Area. And we, the only reason I think we would have moved there back then was potentially to raise money. And we got lucky with some local investors, somewhat local investors, that helped us kind of get some money and get off the ground. And we bootstrapped the company before that, so we had some revenue coming in. And at that point, once you get to enough traction and you're kind of visible around the world, it's easier to then go to the coast if you want to raise money, et cetera. So, I think you can build these companies anywhere. And, if you're scrappy and you're focused on the internet.
So, are you a remote company? Is that what you're saying? Are like a lot of your developers like remote?
Most of our developers are in Madison, but we do have a number of remote people, and we are growing that. So we're trying to be a first-class remote company, and it's been hard, and we've really had to practice. And I think we've gotten a lot better at it this year or the last year or so. But that's been a challenge for us. But yeah, we in the long run, I want to have people working for Ionic all around the world. I don't really want to be limited by geography. I think it's not a great idea for startups to try to go and compete with Google and Facebook in their home turf if you're trying to hire. I think that's really expensive, and you're not going to keep people around. And hiring remote people and finding people around the world, like, that's how I learned to program. That's how I got into this industry in the first place. It feels really natural for me. But yeah, I think remote work is the future. It's hard, and I think we're all going to have to get better at it.
Yeah, I can tell you definitely that we talked to a lot of developers, and they all want to work remote. So I think the developer side is there, and it's getting better. I think it gets better every year.
Yeah, and the tools have gotten a lot better too. Like, Slack has been huge, but even just video chat, like, Zoom and Slack chat, Slack video really, really helped. There's, Skype's been around for a while, but something about it just didn't break into kind of the ubiquitous work environment. So I think we're there, maybe because we all have better internet connections now, but now it's kind of the matter of like the culture. Like, how do you hire remote employees, keep them happy and not feel like they're, second class in the environment, which is something that we haven't always done a great job at, to be honest. But we're identifying that and just realizing like we have to get better. And so some of the things that I do to try to help that, which probably annoys people in the office, is like, I don't do in-person meetings, especially if we have another like remote person. I'll go to my computer and do a video chat. I mean, if everyone's in the office, I'll do it locally, but you really have to like really try to kind of include other people and make sure that you're treating the video discussion as like not just someone dialed in who's listening, but part of like an active part of what you're doing.
Yeah, I was going to say exactly that. I worked remote for many, many years now, and there were environments where I was literally the only remote person in a team of hundreds, and I was definitely a guy on an island. right? But you contrast that with smaller teams where everyone is remote and there's much more of a cohesive community there because everybody can relate. So I agree, and good job on you for seeing that and doing it that way.
Yeah, I mean, I grew up, or I cut my teeth in this industry, like hanging out on IRC and being online. So for me, like that's the normal way of working. You know, the not normal way is being in a cube farm or an open office plan with everyone around and doing a lot of talking.
I'm kind of curious. So you were saying that you bootstrapped, or maybe you got a little bit of investment, but you've been bootstrapping. And just out of curiosity, how does the company make money? I know you have like a paid tier, don't you, with Ionic? But I'm wondering what other ways that you found to kind of monetize. Like, do you do consulting and things like that?
Yeah, so we've actually raised a decent amount of money at this point, a little over 12 million. So we're not really bootstrapped anymore. But the whole business model behind Ionic is, and I think we're going to see more of these kinds of open source business models. We've made this open source project, Ionic Framework, and we've got a lot of people using it, a lot of web developers using it, and they're building apps from startups up to large enterprise companies. And for us, the business model started to develop, especially when we started to get those enterprise users, because if you can show that you've built something that big companies are using and they're relying on, and they'll find you in some respects and want more. And so we've had to be diligent about what that more means. So we don't actually do consulting or custom development, but we do have additional software that kind of takes the open source part further. So for us, our main thing right now is this product called Ionic Pro, which is, we call it a mobile DevOps platform, which is a fairly new term, but the idea is you're building with Ionic Framework, or a good analogy here would be like you're building with React Native, and then there's a bunch of software on top that can kind of help you push updates to your app remotely, do builds, CI stuff, and we call that like the pro layer. So you pay monthly for that, and that's how we make most of our money, and that's probably going to be our biggest kind of growth area. And then in the enterprise, there's a lot of different things that you can do that you don't really expect, and I've really had to learn a lot about these big companies because I just didn't have a lot of experience working in that environment. But it's amazing how many things that they need help with and are willing to pay for. And I think that enterprise part of the business is probably going to be our biggest focus going forward.
So let's take a step back. Can you kind of talk about Ionic, where it started and kind of like where it is now, and then maybe where it's kind of headed in the future?
Yeah, so I told a little bit of the story when I think the audio was messed up, but I'll just go back and kind of mention some of that. So we initially were doing jQuery mobile development, and this was back in like 2012. And I think jQuery mobile really was that first kind of sweet spot where you had web developers who wanted to build mobile apps, but there weren't really any tools targeted at them. And the native development ecosystem was like outright antagonistic about those kinds of developers building apps. And so, we had built a kind of our first part of the company on jQuery mobile, and we were really excited about it, but we just felt like this was probably around the time the iPhone 5 came out. We felt like the browsers and the phones had gotten fast enough that you could do some really native style stuff with JavaScript. And around the same time, Angular, this was 2013, Angular had just released like Angular 1.2, and it was kind of exploding. And so we wanted to see if there was a way you could make a better jQuery mobile that was a little bit more focused on these like single page apps that had kind of emerged. So we ended up kind of building what ultimately was sold as like a, mobile development framework for Angular. And that was our pitch early on. And so that community was really passionate and was looking for additional things to add on to their Angular love. And so Ionic was like a good fit for people who want to build mobile apps. So this was like 2013, 2014. that community really was how we got our start. And Angular's been a really big part of Ionic for the last 2 or 3, 4 years at this point. And yeah, so we've always been focused on the web, and that's really been something that we've stayed very true to. We consider ourselves web native. So we want to support whatever, the web, wherever the web runs. We want to help developers build apps with it and give them UI components and tools that make their lives easier. So going forward, I think everyone knows what's happened in front end, right? Like Angular wasn't the thing that totally won, and everything else, like we're all using Angular today. There was a kind of an explosion of different frameworks and different approaches. Obviously, React has kind of been a breakout success, but now, Vue is coming out, and you've got these new projects like Polymer and Stencil, which we created for building web components. And so our strategy has shifted a little bit to kind of say, we just want to be that UI layer for web developers who are targeting browser runtime. We don't really care what framework they're using. Like if you want to use Angular, React, or Vue, or you want to use, vanilla JavaScript or even jQuery, we want to give you rich JavaScript controls that work in that environment. And that's really our changing focus, what we're really most excited about.
So is there going to be like a future version of Ionic that you can target Vue and React and Angular, or is that already something you can do now? Or is that going to be something completely different than Ionic?
Yeah, so you can kind of do it now, and we're working on Ionic 4, which is the 4.0 release that is going to have specific support for other frameworks. And what we've done, like over the last 4 years, we've rebuilt Ionic 2 or 3 times at this point. So the first time we built it for Angular 1, and we bound it, it was very tightly bound to Angular 1's component model. In 2015, Angular 2 started kind of being hinted, and we worked closely with the Angular team to rebuild it for Angular 2. And so we kind of realized like we never wanted to do that again, not because Angular was a bad choice, but because you spend so much time building custom bindings for frameworks that you end up not being able to do all the things you want to do on your part of the stack. Like we felt like we were letting our UI components suffer a little bit because we were spending so much time dealing with, Angular's component model, the tooling around it. And it really was just because that was maybe the wrong place for us to kind of bind around. So web components have been something that we've been very, very intrigued about because it gave us that promise of being able to ship reusable JavaScript components, but without having to really tightly bind to, a specific framework and build all this custom stuff. So, we've built a new tool called Stencil, which is a web component compiler. And the cool thing about it is it uses TypeScript, so we can build these components using TypeScript, and it's kind of a merge between React and Angular because we like a lot about Angular and we like a lot about React. So there's some JSX, but it's a class-based, uses decorators, so it looks like kind of a blend between the two. And we have tools that will process that and output web components, but also we can output framework bindings for it automatically without having to maintain them. So Josh actually is working on this right now for React. We will be able to generate pretty much first-class React components using this Stencil tool. They'll use web components underneath in a way that plays nice with React, but then we don't have to maintain a custom React binding. So we can work on our components, which is what we're best at, and then everyone can benefit no matter what framework they're using. That's kind of the where we're going, because we never want to rewrite Ionic for another framework ever again.
Yeah, that's cool. So with that, were you able to branch out from a mobile focus to just web in general?
Yeah, so we're really excited about progressive web apps, and we're also excited about kind of traditional desktop apps and Electron apps. So, mobile is where a lot of exciting stuff is happening, but especially as we've started to do more work with enterprise companies, there's a lot more diversity in kind of the devices and the screen sizes and things that they're using. They'll have someone, a field agent on a phone. You've got someone in the office using a laptop, someone's on desktop, tablet, etc. So the web paradigm is kind of a good fit for their needs. And so we're trying to be a little bit more device agnostic and to work both on mobile and on desktop. What we've had to do to get there has been, fairly straightforward. I think people are used to app style layouts now. They're a little more used to like having a menu and having tabs. And we find that it actually maps fairly well to different screen sizes if you're just a little bit smart about how you lay things out. And, it's kind of like responsive design, but to the next level. And so we're finding that's actually taking us pretty far and people are pretty happy with it. So, I think, we want to run wherever the browser runs pretty much.
So I know that you're working on something called Capacitor. Can you talk about that a little bit and how that fits into all this stuff?
Yeah, so most people who know Ionic know that we have historically been based on Cordova. And we picked Cordova back in 2013 because it was, the de facto way to build web apps that had connectors into native land. And we love Cordova. We're huge fans. Certainly not trying to bring any negativity on that project because it's been hugely important for us. But we just felt like we were being asked to provide more support and a little more expertise over that part of the stack, which is like, my app is interacting with this iOS SDK, but it's returning the wrong data or it's crashing on iOS 11. And we were kind of just saying like, cool, that's not really our problem. Go file an issue on someone's, GitHub repo. And it got to the point where like that became a liability for us, both for, our business, but also like, being able to tell a customer like, sorry, we can't help you. It's just not something that you really want to do because, they're entrusting us to help them with every part of the stack. And they don't necessarily know where Ionic stops and where it begins because there's so many layers to the onion. So that was kind of the initial motivation, was just to get a little more expertise at the native layer. But also, when we started looking into what a new Cordova would look like with, being inspired by all the other projects out there like React Native and TurboLinks, we decided that it made sense to build something new and to also try to make it more friendly for that multi-device thing that I kind of mentioned. So treating progressive web apps and web apps as a first-class citizen and kind of targeting one app that had connectors for, iOS and Android, but also Electron and also for the web. And trying to make it a little more seamless because people are struggling. They're building an app for iOS and Android and then running it in the browser and like it was erroring out because they were trying to use a plugin that didn't exist, even though it wasn't really necessary for that screen and that experience. So just trying to smooth all that out and just make it a little more of a more integrated experience into Ionic.
So that's like a very hefty thing to be doing, like a very large amount of work in my head, at least, because you're basically trying to implement these native SDKs on the web, right? Pretty much. Is that kind of what you're going to be doing for iOS and Android?
So it's kind of like, it's actually, to use an analogy, it's very similar to React Native in a lot of respects. And I think there's a lot more in common with Cordova and React Native than people realize. In particular, like the way you build plugins is very, very similar. They obviously React Native has a little more kind of type inference, so to speak, in a different way that you interface with the APIs. But generally, the idea is the same, right? Like you have a native method, you get some data from the client, you do something natively, and you return it back. So that part is kind of a solved problem. And what I liked about what React Native does is it kind of statically loads all the plugins. So you don't have to worry about, if you've done Cordova development, you have to worry about like device ready. But if you just load all your plugins in advance, they're all ready by the time your app loads. So there's like, tweaks that you can make, but at the core, it's pretty much as simple as that. I get some data, do some native functionality and return it. Managing all that and kind of managing the plugins, the lifecycle of the app. There's a little more work involved there, but actually most of the work goes into the CLI and kind of the tooling around managing dependencies, building your project. This has been my pet project for the last 3 or 4 months. So I've been working on it pretty much 100%. So my head's pretty deep in it right now. But it was a lot of work, but it was also less work than I had anticipated, just because The APIs and native APIs have gotten so much better. You have, we use WK WebView on iOS. It's just so much easier to pass data back and forth. Whereas before you had to do a bunch of hacks to UI WebView to get it to process data. It was a lot slower. So I think we're just lucky that we're doing this in 2018 when APIs have really advanced on both sides.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense because the browsers have been doing a really good job of adding features and making things easier. So that's pretty interesting. I'm wondering, did you have to know a lot about the native platforms for iOS and Android to do this stuff, or kind of like not?
Well, I've done some native development in my past, so I was pretty familiar with it. And just we've interacted with it over the last few years, just here and there, just by working on Ionic. So I wasn't a stranger to it, but I certainly wasn't like a professional native developer at all. My reaction to spending the last few months kind of really deep into it is this stuff's probably, writing Swift and Java and working with the SDKs. It's not necessarily too hard for web developers to do or too hard for developers to learn. I think the problem with it is it's a lot of work to do the same thing on each platform. And I know that's kind of like the hybrid / cross-platform mantra, but it really is true. Like I build a plugin for Capacitor that takes a photo, right, on iOS and Android, and you get the same result in the end, right? I get like a JPEG file that I load from the file system and I render it to an image. But the way you do that on iOS and Android are so very different that, like, I think that's where it's hard. It's not the APIs and SDKs are hard to use because if you've done any kind of native development on any platform ever, it's very much the same thing. It's just that they're so different and opinionated that bringing them together is a lot of work.
Yeah, that's the whole reason why Ionic is such a good thing is because nobody wants to do that. Nobody wants to do the work you're doing.
Yeah, and like I love native development. It's fun, and I've been having a lot of fun writing Swift because it kind of feels like TypeScript. But you get the feeling like this is why I am building cross-platform tools, because I'm just not the kind of person who really sees a lot of value in like knowing Android inside and out and only doing that, because it feels really limiting. Like I think the reason we all use JavaScript and a lot of us build for the web is because you can build pretty much for anything. And so when you're building like an Android app or an iOS app, it feels really constricting. I don't like that.
Yeah, I mean the logic, the problem solving, that's the fun part. Duplicating that in another language is not the fun part.
Yeah, definitely not. Feels like a lot of duplicated work. But I've actually kind of fallen in love with, like I said, Swift, but actually Android Studio, which I didn't expect. I've been spending a lot of time in Android Studio, and the shortcuts are pretty legit. It's fast. It's got great like Vim emulation. So definitely recommend spending some time in there. I think IntelliJ is pretty awesome.
Yeah, when they switched, it definitely had a huge improvement.
So for developers that are kind of listening that have been, maybe using React Native for the last few months or few years and haven't really kind of taken a look at Ionic, what types of apps are people building with Ionic? I mean, I don't think it's really limited to anything, but is it okay to build games? Is it okay to build like business type of applications, e-commerce? Like, what kind of apps are people building and what kind of apps are people not building?
Yeah, it's a good question. It is kind of all over the board. I think there's some sweet spots that Ionic is really well suited for. I would say games is not one of those. And I think, we're primarily based on web technology, and I think web technology just hasn't really taken off for games, but I'm excited about things like WebVR, et cetera. Data-driven business apps are really kind of the sweet spot. I think we certainly have like flagship consumer apps being built with Ionic, and you can definitely build them, and we have our own, and we're really happy with them. But for us, like the data-driven business apps kind of where we're seeing the most growth. And, when I think about Ionic, the company and the business, what gets me the most excited about is kind of the stuff that you don't see, which is where a lot of the work is actually going into. So We work with some companies that are building, tens, if not hundreds of apps for a lot of different things that they need to do internally. And these are things that like you can't really anticipate unless you know that business inside and out. And often that's a learning experience for us. But, you've got people in the field, they're storing data, storing it offline, uploading it, filling out forms. You can build anything with these technologies, but that's kind of the thing I'm most excited about is that use case.
Yeah, and the framework agnostic direction you guys are going now is pretty huge too.
Yeah, I mean, we talk to a lot of people who they want to use Ionic, but they don't use Angular. And kind of like what I was saying before, that we realize like the framework and the UI thing, they're not necessarily intertwined. They don't need to have anything they don't need to be so tightly bound. And what happened over the last few years in the company is we started hiring a lot of people who were interested in other things besides Angular, like Josh, who's very much a React guy. And so the company culture changed a little bit where we were a little more diverse on the front end. But we felt like these components would be valuable for a lot of different people and wanted to change that. And I think about like React, and there's a lot of people, and I've talked to a decent number of people in the React community that are interested in continuing to build with traditional web technologies, even mobile apps. Like they want to build, a lot of the content in different pages with the web, and maybe they want to wrap it with like a native, navigation controller or a native menu, but they're happy with a lot of the app being built on the web. We were hoping that they'll find Ionic useful for a lot of those pages. That's one type of developer, but then also I noticed like React Native Web is kind of becoming notable, and we hope that we've got a pretty compelling option there for people who are interested in that kind of project. Potentially we're thinking about how we might map some of our components that we generate for React to be follow the React Native tag names like view and text view and things like that. So kind of experimenting with that right now, and Josh is working on that. But I hope if you're in the React community and you like building web apps, you want to kind of build an app that's going to run in a lot of different places that has a browser, we hope you'll find the Ionic components to be really helpful when they come out, which is going to be probably in April.
So there's always these discussions on Twitter and things about kind of what you're talking about, the web, I guess performance and kind of like people have different opinions on like if you're building a mobile application, should you use web technologies or native technologies? I'm kind of curious, what is your take on the current state? Because I know there's been just tons of improvement over the last couple of years, and the web continues to, improve pretty quickly. But, where do you see, are we at a point now where you can kind of build apps that are almost truly native feeling with some of these web technologies? And that's my first question. And then my second question is, does Capacitor fit in separately from Ionic, or is it something you use with Ionic, or is it something that you use kind of on its own?
Yeah, so to answer the first question, I think there's a good class of applications where that's absolutely true, where the performance you get is imperceptibly fast as any other app. And I say that as a company that also builds its apps with Ionic that we're really happy with, that we've never felt like didn't feel native on iOS or Android. I think there's always there's overhead with the web platform. I think there's no sense in denying that. It adds overhead. It's not as fast from a pure raw performance standpoint as rendering native views or writing native code. And so for us, that used to be something that we were insecure about, but now we know there's enough people out there that are going to build things that they're going to be really happy with Ionic, and they're going to do it quickly. They're going to use that web development background they already have. And if what they're trying to build is a little more ambitious and it's just not, web animations just aren't cutting it for them, then maybe it's not a good option. I think they should know that in advance. But if you're willing to tune those things, you can definitely get past a lot of roadblocks. We find that we have to provide a lot of stuff out of the box. We really focus on performance and trying to make things fast. and use kind of the best browser techniques to get performance. Otherwise, sometimes people can kind of shoot themselves in the foot animating the wrong properties. Web developers know this well. You start animating things like margin left and suddenly your app feels terrible and stuttering and slow. So I think there's a little bit of an education process that has to go on about how to get fast performance and giving people tools that avoid some of those pitfalls. So we've had to kind of learn that and try to build better primitives. But yeah, I think a lot of people are successful with it. And I think it's just going to continue to get better. So I'm really bullish on it. I think with PWAs coming into the picture, it's exciting for us because, the web being a first-class citizen for building apps, you kind of have to make it work, right? So we think that's going to push us to make Ionic a lot better, build a lot more controls, and really be kind of a first-class offering in that space. So so about Capacitor, the second question. You could think of Capacitor as kind of it's a replacement for Cordova. So it has a web view that it communicates to native code back and forth, kind of through JavaScript. But you can the thing that we're trying to do to make it a little bit more modern is be able to wrap that web view with native controls, and this is something that has been popularized with a lot of apps. Like a lot of popular hybrid apps use this technique where they'll use like a native shell, like navigation control, or a menu, and then have a lot of the content be built with web technology. So we want to make that easy if that's something that you want. So just being able to wrap in like UI navigation controller or a side menu or, tabs if you want, and then build most of the app with web content. We're trying to make that easy with Capacitor.
That makes a lot of sense now. That actually explains quite a bit, and that's super, super cool. I like that.
Yeah, we're just trying to hit that sweet spot where we're appealing to a web developer, but we give them kind of those like my boss just needs to have this like the native nav controller, and it's like that one component that they have to have because it feels really nice, it feels smooth, but if the rest of the app is built with HTML and JavaScript and CSS, everyone's happy. So I think that's a sweet spot. And actually, the Basecamp people, 37 Signals, DHH, that's kind of been a strategy that they've employed quite a bit as kind of this hybrid sweet spot. So we're trying to dial that in.
So do you have like a set of components that are going to kind of be available? So it's already available as alpha, and you mentioned that it's going to be beta soon. Like, how many components or how many different APIs can you use with Capacitor when it becomes, available for like maybe version 1 or something? What are y'all shooting for?
I'm counting right now. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Probably about 15 to 20 APIs. I mean, everything from taking photos, doing background tasks, copying to the clipboard, file system, geolocation. So we're trying to just kind of get the core things that we think people are going to use. The other thing that we're doing, which I think is going to be a little bit more controversial, I think people are struggling, and this isn't just limited to Cordova, but Cordova is a victim of this because it's just so popular. People are struggling with wanting more support from the plugins they're using, and React Native, I think, has this challenge too. You've got all these volunteers who are building plugins and people are relying on them, but there's no way to kind of guarantee they're going to be updated or maintained. So we're going to be releasing a commercial pack of plugins that are kind of like hard plugins to build, that require a lot of work and maintenance. And we're hoping that by having like kind of a balancing the need to be afford to work on this stuff, like, open source maintainability and sustainability, with, a fair price that people can rely on and have updates. We hope to solve some of that kind of uncertainty, because like people tell us the reason they leave Cordova is because they're relying on this plugin that some dude wrote that he stopped maintaining it and it crashes in iOS 11. And that's not a Cordova specific problem. That's an open source specific problem. And we're a business, but we also want to solve that because I think it becomes a liability for us. So part of this is that we plan to have some of those. Certainly you could go use the free open source ones. Like we're totally fine with that. But we're experimenting and seeing if that kind of solves people's trepidation with relying on like open source components.
So is this something you've already tried to do, or is this something that's going to be coming out like with Capacitor, these kind of official or these supported components and APIs, because this is absolutely something like I see with React Native and different packages. It's like, okay, this package does what I need it to do. At least that's what the README says it does. But does it actually, work in this latest version? And like, this is something that I've been intrigued, but I have got no idea like how you actually approach this. So it's very interesting hearing this kind of pay for support, and like, how do you actually go approach that? Is it like a one-time purchase, or kind of like a subscription, a maintenance type fee that you would charge?
That's a good question. I think whatever this thing is probably going to come out a little bit later. We just kind of want to get Capacitor, like the open source stuff, working and being, really solid and replacing Cordova for some apps. Long term, I think the business model is there's some different ideas going around the company right now. Probably there's some kind of recurring aspect to it, whether that's, the updated version, you have to pay for updates, just like kind of like Sketch does on desktop. That's probably the one that balances kind of the continual need to work on these things and the cost that's kind of recurring. So I think there's probably a recurring aspect to it. I'm seeing some interesting models in open source for sustainability, like the Open Collective and things like that. I think it's a little bit harder when you have individuals who don't have like a umbrella to work under. So I don't know what the answer is. I've toyed around with an idea of like a plugin fund, where you could pay into this fund as like a customer potentially, and that fund pays out to different people that work on plugins or manage PRs. And I think that's interesting, but then you have to manage that fund, and that's work. So I don't know. It's a hard problem, but I think it's something that has to be solved. And sometimes I feel like the ones who are going to provide the best solution are like the businesses like Ionic or like Exponent, Expo in React Native ecosystem. They're probably going to have the best answer in the shortest amount of time because they're commercializing the whole stack. So yeah, it's a hard problem, but I think it's like we have to find a better solution because it's just not sustainable.
This is my biggest pet peeve with React Native, the fact everything you just talked about, because it's actually pretty bad when you can't even have a Google sign-in for a React Native application because it isn't available and no one has created and maintained one. And not that I'm saying like the developers are bad for not doing it, because, thank you for all the stuff that they've done and all the stuff that we've done. We do our best, but you're investing all this time and money, in your company to build a mobile application, and you're relying on this framework. And the fact that some of the most like essential business needs cannot be met, even though there's like, tens and hundreds of millions of dollars behind the companies using this framework, like, why isn't that problem solved yet? Like, I don't have the answer to it. It's just like, maybe what you're doing, like if someone would do that for React Native, it would actually be awesome, because we would, that is a problem. And if you solve this in a way for Cordova or for Capacitor, you could definitely get a lot of developers from other ecosystems like React Native, probably from native even, because you're just solving a huge problem.
Yeah, I think it comes down to developers being afraid to charge for things. It's one of our greatest features, and also something that I think holds us back in some regards. Like, we don't want to charge for these plugins because we want everyone to use them. And having a lot of people using something is valuable, but my perspective on that is we built Ionic as a kind of like, I always joke, like we always kind of had like a Silicon Valley mindset to Ionic. Like, let's just get everyone using it and we'll worry about making money later. And we finance the business by raising venture capital and all this stuff. And you just get to a point where you realize, like, without a foundation of kind of a value exchange that makes sense on both sides, you're actually in a pretty weak position. Either that growth levels off because there's a finite number of developers, or you commercialize so heavily that you don't have a community. And so I think developers just need to be a little more willing to charge, because they're complaining about problems that can be solved with a more balanced kind of business approach. Like, if I pay you for something and you do that thing in a way that you're happy to do that thing, like, that's a win-win. And we get paid a lot. A lot of us are working in businesses that are making a lot of money, like you just said. And I think we're just kind of coming to the conclusion that, paying someone for something is actually potentially in our best interest. And the other thing I'll say too is, like, maybe a little bit of a rallying cry to would-be entrepreneurs. Like, this is a great space to be in. It feels like developers don't pay for things, but I can tell you firsthand, they definitely do. It's just you kind of have to solve problems, and it's not so much like, oh, they're just buying this one little component I made. It's like, no, I'm solving your mobile development problems. Like, I'm helping you with a lot of different things. And just, I think there's a lot of opportunity in this space, whether it's React Native or Ionic or, something completely different. And so, if you're out there kind of on the fringes, like, I hope you'll consider that developers do spend money on things, and it's actually a really great space to be in.
What you're talking about makes a lot of sense. Like, me personally, I would pay $100 a month to have access to kind of a quality set of components that solve things very well for things like navigation and for certain OAuth providers and a few other things here and there. And most of the companies that I've worked with would definitely pay in the range of $100 to $1,000 a month for these things, depending on, their budget, I guess, and kind of what kind of concerns they have. Because really, they're spending hundreds of thousands of dollars a year on developers to kind of, make up for the things that are not in the ecosystem anyway. So it would actually save them money if they could just pay someone to maintain some of the really, really important core things. And for me, those things are like UI components, navigation, and OAuth. Those three seem to be the biggest ones for me that are not there.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think companies are also, like, especially in bigger enterprises, like, they're fairly new to open source. And a lot of them came from being like Microsoft customers and paying for a lot of different things like .NET controls and Visual Studio. And so they were okay with that for a little bit. But then open source came along, and it turned out that some of the best products on the market were actually totally free in open source. And I think we're kind of going roundabout back to the original understanding, which is, like, if I pay you for something, then we're kind of both incentivized to help each other. And right now we just have an imbalance. So I totally agree. If you're solving those problems, like, companies will pay a lot of money for that, especially the bigger companies. I mean, I think that's the biggest opportunity. But even small teams and consultancies and dev shops are a great place to build a developer tools company.
Yeah, I think there's I guess a mind issue with this bad irony that you're using an open source tool and then you're paying for some, components for this open source tool. You're in the open source community. That's the whole point. It's open source. It's, code and free love and all that stuff. So there's this hurdle that people have to get over to realize, okay, it's great that React is based on open source from a huge company like Facebook. That doesn't mean that we can't build paying real companies around that, and that's just, we haven't gotten there yet. We haven't jumped that hurdle to merge the open source and the commercial together, because there always seems to be at odds with each other.
Yeah. And I think companies like Facebook and Google deserve a lot of credit for investing heavily in open source, but they have their own incentives. And I think some of the best opportunities to help developers with a lot of different problems that are kind of free from some of those overlapping incentives is to have, like, independent companies and small to big businesses solving developer tools problems. Because then they're going to solve, like, I'll do a Google connector for React Native. I'm not sure Facebook would do that.
Yeah. And you had mentioned earlier, I know we kind of stopped you to get a little bit of the backstory, but you had mentioned you guys pro service, and that incentivized around DevOps more, right? So it's kind of like this whole look, and DevOps is becoming a thing. People are willing to charge for and okay to pay for, even though it's an open source project. So that's definitely an area that seems to be kind of catching on and getting it a little better.
Yeah, and I think there's definitely things that we felt like were off limits for charging. Like you can't charge for the buttons and the things that just help you build the app. Because if you do, then like you'll get people paying for it, but you're probably going to limit your addressable market. So if you can balance like giving enough away for free and in a way that's actually valuable, like we consider Ionic Framework like one of our most important products. Like it's not just an open source thing we do for free. Like it is the lifeblood of the company. So we really consider it a major product, but we kind of have to balance like what's free to get lots of people using this with where do we build that commercial layer that helps all those people using it. So just kind of being a little bit smart about business models. And if anyone's listening to this, like if you're interested in talking about this stuff, like I love talking to potential founders and entrepreneurs, especially in this space. So definitely willing to help out.
So we're kind of getting close on time. But before we wrap it up, is there anything that anyone wants to discuss that we haven't already kind of gone over? So Max, where should people listening kind of go to get started with Ionic? And is like right now a good time to go ahead and jump in, or should they wait for a certain upcoming release or anything like that?
Yeah, we're a little bit behind on the React specific stuff, but we're targeting April. So, you'll be able to go to ionicframework.com and get a version, npm install a version that works with React perfectly. So probably April for that. So we're a little bit behind on that. If you're interested in Capacitor, you can check it out. It's an alpha version. It works perfectly with React because it's like a web view. So you can use whatever you want in that web view. But you can go to capacitor.ionicframework.com if you want to check that out.
I'm super interested in seeing the React version of Ionic. Is it going to be kind of like a separate repo or a separate, like, a separate thing as far as like in the documentation?
We're trying to keep it somewhat seamless. So, imagine you go to the docs. We're working on this right now, actually. If you go to the docs, you'll be able to just kind of say, I want the React version. And, a lot of the concepts and the content's the same, but the code snip is different. The installation instructions are different. But it's just going to be as simple as npm installing and just kind of getting to work. So, it should be. We're trying to make it very natural for React developers. And, we actually use React inside of Ionic. So I think we've got some good empathy for what makes a good React API, hopefully. So I think people will like it.
Cool. So I guess we'll go ahead and get to the picks. Lee, do you have any picks tonight?
Yeah, there's for the JavaScriptReport.com, there's kind of what's new in JavaScript frameworks. They just released it March 19th. And it's interesting because, we did the podcast with Sasha and the state of JavaScript, and it kind of covers a lot of that, kind of an updated view of that. And it's interesting kind of to see the trends. Vue is still growing really fast, and month-to-month growth, although it's overall, it's nowhere near the React growth, but it touches on Vue and React and Angular, and it covers a little bit of the React 16, React 17 talk. So there's a lot of good information in one place. It kind of up to date here and there, almost to next quarter. So that was pretty cool.
Spencer, do you have any picks?
Yeah, I'm going to go a little bit off the wall here. And if you're looking to kind of get out of technology land, I just finished reading a book. It's called Travels with Charlie in Search of America. It's by the author John Steinbeck, and it's about this it's like a travel log of a trip across the country he took in 1960. And it's a really awesome story, and just kind of listening about the challenges of the country and the insights he took on this trip. So yeah, it was a book I've enjoyed reading the last week or so. So definitely suggest checking it out.
Very cool. I'll have to check that out. Two of my favorite books are from Steinbeck, Cannery Row and East of Eden. So I actually haven't heard of what was the name of that book?
Travels with Charlie in Search of America.
Okay, that's going to be added to my list.
Yeah,
Very
if you like his books, you're gonna love it.
Awesome. Okay, Max, do you have any picks?
Yeah. So if you follow me on Twitter, you know I got my first mechanical keyboard recently, and I'm obsessed with it. I've been a Mac user for a while, and I've used all the Mac keyboards and kind of religiously stuck with that equipment. And I found I was kind of getting fatigue, wrist pain, etc. The Mac products just aren't very ergonomic. So anyways, I got this new mechanical keyboard from the company WASD. It's a WASD V2. And so if you're on the fence about getting a new keyboard, or maybe you don't like the new MacBook keyboards, definitely check it out, because I was hesitant and I'm like obsessed with it. I love it. It's such like a pleasure to type on. So
I have two picks. The first is a blog post that I saw today. It's called "What Happens When My React Native Application Starts," and it's a pretty deep technical dive into like what's going on under the hood. And I always have a difficult time explaining this because it's so complex, and I don't honestly even understand everything that's going on. This person also agrees with the complexity and that he also cannot explain everything, but he explains a lot of things. And I learned quite a bit from reading it. So his name is Nicholas Kovrat, and the name of the post is "Wait, What Happens When My React Native Application Starts?" And it's in the Get Connected Medium blog, which is also pretty good if you want to follow that. It's one of my favorite Medium blogs. They have a lot of good JavaScript stuff in there. And then my second pick is the AWS Amplify library that I kind of work with. We just added push notifications for React Native, so you can send push notifications for iOS and Android using AWS Amplify now, which is cool because that wasn't there like a week ago or 2 weeks ago. We released it maybe 2 weeks ago. So it was released, and I just kind of put together a couple of resources on it, a YouTube video and a blog post that'll be out on the React Native training blog by the time this comes out. So if you're interested in that, check it out. That wraps up the show. Max, nice to kind of sit down and talk to you. Learned a lot, and it was really good getting to know you. And thanks for taking the time out of your schedule to join us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a lot of fun. I appreciate it.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for listening. This wraps up episode 93 of React Native Radio. We'll see you next week.